What does a psychologist have to say about the NFL draft? It turns out a lot. In today's episode, Mike and Ben speak with Dr. Ken Yusko about his work with the NFL. It's pretty cool stuff. I hope you can stick around. Hi, welcome to Cracking the Shell on Psychological Science. I'm here with Dr. Ben Jones and Dr. Ken Yusko, who is a professor of psychology here in the Department of Psychology.
Thanks so much for having me.
You work with the NFL. I think a lot of people listening might find that interesting. Could you tell us a little bit about the projects that you do with the NFL?
Sure. So my background is in industrial organizational psychology, and I focus on assessing and developing employees. So that approach really goes well beyond sports, and my roots go back to non-sports applications. So I've worked with the United Nations and Merck and Morgan Stanley, lots of different companies. And then we basically took our learning and transported it to the sports world.
So why would the sports world care about, some of these topics? So you're trying to help assess people. I think they have coaches, right, that could do that. So what are you adding?
Yeah, they have lots of talented people that work on lots of different levels and from different perspectives. They have coaches, they have sports psychologists, clinical psychologists. And so what we found is IO psychology contributed a perspective that hadn't been typical up to this point. So the clinicals and the sports psychologists, they tend to work with smaller groups in a sports context. They might work individually with players, they might work with small teams, small units and teams, but nobody really took an organizational level perspective, collected data across a league, for example. So that's where IO psychology kind of helped provide that extra perspective.
One thing we talk about with psychology is operational definitions, trying to figure out what success looks like. So how does success defined in an NFL context?
Yeah, so it's like any other job. There's really no difference in being an IO psychologist in sports versus any other job, except that the criteria for success are measured so obsessively on so many different levels, and the number of skills it takes to be successful in sports. Somebody once compared it to being a NASA astronaut, right? So in other jobs, you don't have, for example, the dominance of physical ability. And so the NFL has done an amazing job over the years of really understanding players' physical skills. But they hadn't always approached psychological capabilities with the same in-depth approach. And so we said when we got to talk to them in their office in New York, one thing you can do is start to use in-depth psychological assessment involving all the players across the league and look at whether they're underperforming or overperforming given their physical ability. So that was our approach.
Can I ask you how much of this dials into something like the Moneyball?
It's all about Moneyball. In fact, we characterized our approach as Moneyball Plus. So with Moneyball, they started looking at different avenues for success and impact, going past what is traditionally called batting average and looking at exit velocity, for example. And so Moneyball was a way to find new value that was unexploited at the time. And so Billy Beane had once said, a dollar's worth of Moneyball is now worth 50 cents. Why? Because teams started using similar approaches.
Right.
So the Yankees got to use Moneyball when originally, the Oakland A's, a small market team, was using it very well. So what we said to the teams was, we can add competitive data to the mix that other teams don't have. And so it becomes harder to copy. And so that was the aspect of Moneyball that was tougher to copy. Now, when you're working for a whole league and all of the teams get the data, then it becomes which teams use the data best.
So you're saying the word data a lot. This seems like a data-driven science.
It's not just about collecting information on the skills of the player. It's about showing that having those skills actually directly contributes, one, to organizational success, but two, more importantly maybe, that you're measuring those skills accurately in the first place. That's all about data.
You mentioned earlier psychological assessment, and I'm curious what types of psychological assessment or what types of tools do you try to assess athletes on?
It's about what we would call competencies or knowledge, skills, and abilities that are relevant for the job. So we would measure things like leadership and teamwork, dependability, stress tolerance, ability to learn quickly, ability to avoid errors in your decision making. Those kinds of attributes that are certainly rooted in psychological assessment, but not about psychopathology or somebody being struggling with psychological issues.
When you say measurement, one of the things that comes to my mind are validity criterion. Yeah. And I'm hoping that you can tell us something about the validity criterion that you look at in related to this.
Yeah, I mean, that's everything, because especially in the field of industrial organizational psychology, there are lots of proposed solutions and products out there. And one of the things you have to really look closely at is, do these products, tests in this case, assessments of psychological abilities, do they translate to actual performance differences? So we call that criteria for success, and it comes on many levels. One might be the way the coach sees you. Are you dependable? Are you prepared? Do you learn quickly? Maybe more importantly is, how do you play on the field? Are the people who are scoring higher on these tests the ones who are getting more snaps, getting more starts, contributing to on-field success more, like yards after catch or fumbles or turnovers or point differential? How about people over time who succeed? They learn quickly and then they keep on developing across the seasons. How about people who become Pro Bowl or All Pros? And so there's lots of different levels of success that we can look at, and that's why sports is so special, because there's so much data on all of these different levels.
Some of these psychological traits that you mentioned seem like traits that somebody's just born with, and then other things maybe you're measuring are somewhat skill-based that could be developed. So what is the balance there? Do people try to hack the test and figure out what they want you to answer, or is this just something that you can't really prep for?
Yeah, so that's a really good point. In employment testing, people are built and geared towards trying to, what you're calling hacking the test, to try and present themselves in a way that gives them the best chance of getting the job. Well, we transport that approach to the sports assessment world, and we also assume that people want the job and they're going to do as well as they can on the test. And so that's one difference where IO psychology employment testing helps, I think, make sure that you're measuring what you're supposed to be measuring. In terms of the question about development versus are you born with it, it's probably different ranges for these different facets, dimensions, like learning ability versus how prepared you are. But one thing we found is that within a given person's range, you certainly can develop. You can use strategies, you can get better. And the other part that's really important is there are multiple pathways to success, right? So let's say you're not as quick on your feet as some other players, or you don't learn as quickly. Well, preparing and putting in the work beforehand can go a long way to not needing to think exactly on the spot. The other part is coaches creating situations that maximize players' ability to be effective, right? And not putting them in positions where they might fail, or putting them in a position where they're most likely to succeed.
So I'm curious if you see programmatic differences across different college teams that translate into either better preparedness, or the athletes themselves present better on your tests because of their history.
Yeah, it's a great question. It really depends on where the athlete brings the most value. So So for example, the elite athletes who are physically the most gifted, they're probably going to be successful on some level because they're most physically talented. But those are the athletes who then maybe if you focus on the other attributes, the psychological attributes, the development side, maybe the upside is even higher. So, that's probably an individual phenomenon. You're talking about grouping it by program, but I think it depends on the individual.
How much value does your test bring above and beyond standard practice? Or, is it a 1% increase or 2%, 5%, 25%? What's the added validity?
Yeah, so incremental validity is the expression we use, and that's really important. We don't look at a baseline and say this is what our assessment delivers. What we look at is we want to make sure our test is valid for the purpose it's being used. We are steeped in the data, as I said, that comes from our work. We work for building fair employment tests a lot. We do a fair amount of employment litigation to fix broken processes. We work with the Justice Department often, and so we're used to building a tool that works really well. So our focus is on making sure that we are confident in the results. And then we say, if you have other tools that are valid, that other tools that can give you insights, then you should use multiple tools. And they can converge, and you can start seeing patterns and trends. If you see conflicts across the tools, maybe you get more information so you can be more confident in your decision. The one thing that's really important to point out is even a good tool, even a wonderful psychological assessment is not a crystal ball. It's not the answer, and it's only one part of a decision-making process. So, for example, working with scouts, you'd think that maybe there'd be a conflict, right? What we found is we work closely with the scouts to try and agree on what we were trying to assess, and then we tried to help the scouts assess in ways we would consider to be best practices. They help give us insights, and then we put the two streams of information together, and we were more confident in our conclusions.
I think maybe the last question, I'm sure people listening have found this pretty interesting. What if somebody wanted to get involved in this type of career or this path? Is there something you would advise them to do?
Yeah, it's interesting. Everybody wants to work in sports. It's so interesting, and it attracts people with all different backgrounds. I think if you were interested, certainly the analytics approach is a really great path. A lot of the teams have what some teams are referred to as nerds' nests, the group of professionals from lots of backgrounds that focus on analytics and understanding how to improve performance. We like working with the analytics folks because they can independently assess the impact of our assessment process. So, for example, they'll do their own analyses, and then we'll talk to them, and they'll say, you all did a really nice job here, and here's where you can improve. So we like that kind of independent analysis. But if you're interested in a career, sports is really good at leveraging outside thinking. So rather than thinking you have to grow up in sports to be part of it, they take people from different areas who are bringing best practices and applying it in new ways. And that's what we did from an industrial organizational standpoint.
Well, it was great to have you, Ken. We appreciate all the insight and hope to talk to you sometime soon.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you want to hear more about Ken's work, check out the links in the episode description. And we'll see you later. Bye-bye. Ken, I have one more question for you. How many baseball cards do you have?
Oh, wow. So probably 20,000 baseball cards. Wow. And I collected a lot of them from back when I was 10 years old, but I've picked up a lot since then.
I'm still grateful for the George Brett card you gave me a couple years back. I have it sitting in my office.